She had once rescued lives amidst chaos, yet when destiny called for her own salvation, the system abandoned her until one judge defied convention. It was meant to be a night of calm repose. A harsh, biting wind slashed through the avenues of Columbus, Ohio, urging hurried passers-by to clutch their coats more tightly as they sought refuge in warmer havens. Yet for Vanessa Price, warmth was a distant memory. She curled up in a forsaken building on Livingston Avenue, her back pressed against a fissured wall, while the biting cold infiltrated her meager jacket. It was a sanctuary, however, compared to the unforgiving sidewalk. Vanessa had mastered the art of invisibility, dissolving into the shadows to elude the judgmental glances of those who dismissed her as a mere inconvenience. The city teemed with souls like hers, veterans abandoned and forgotten after sacrificing everything. Yet tonight, her fragile fortune had faltered, a piercing beam of light cleaved through the murk, and deliberate, heavy footsteps resonated off the vacant walls. "Ma'am, you're not allowed here." Vanessa barely lifted her eyes. She had heard this refrain countless times, "Rise, move along, 'cause no trouble," yet tonight, fatigue had subdued her defiance. The tone grew sterner. "Ma'am, you're trespassing now." Two officers from Columbus PD loomed over her. One, youthful and rigid, kept his hand near his holster, while the other, older and bulkier, exhaled as if this scene was all too familiar. "I had nowhere else to go," Vanessa murmured, her voice rasping from the bitter cold. The younger officer snapped, "That's not my problem, get on your feet." Vanessa slowly rose, her joints stiff from nights spent on concrete, as her old army injury, the one that stole her promising future, flared painfully. "Have you got any weapons?" the older officer inquired, more a matter of protocol than genuine concern. Exhausted to the point of numbness, Vanessa merely shook her head, her pride long since eroded. Without warning, the young officer seized her arm forcefully, urging, "Come on, let's go." Vanessa tensed, instinct, a reflex honed through years of discipline, causing her body to stiffen as if back in formation. Misinterpreting this for resistance, the young cop swiftly flipped her face first onto the abrasive pavement, a knee pinning her back. A voice boomed from above, "You're under arrest for trespassing." For a moment, she struggled to breathe, not from physical pressure, but from the crushing weight of despair. Once clad in a proud uniform, saluting the flag and fighting for a nation, she now found herself regarded as nothing more than a nuisance, being dragged off as if she were a common criminal. The older officer exhaled deeply, perhaps recognizing something in her, or perhaps not. Either way, the cuffs snapped closed around her wrists. In that instant, Vanessa Price, former U.S. Army sergeant, transformed into merely another case number in the system, but the true battle had only just commenced. Yet what unfolded next in that stark, fluorescent-lit courtroom would render everyone speechless. The journey to Franklin County Correctional Center was cloaked in silence. Vanessa sat at the rear of the patrol car, her wrists throbbing from the tight cuffs, as the city lights smeared past the window, though she refused to glance at them. She had witnessed every facet of this city, marching through its streets in uniform, wandering in search of employment, and now, she was being ferried through its veins as though branded a criminal. At the station, they captured her fingerprints, snapped her photo, and stripped away the remnants of her dignity. A uniformed female officer quietly handed her a pair of threadbare slippers and an orange jumpsuit, instructing, "Change," while deftly avoiding her gaze. Vanessa paused, clutching the fabric in her trembling hand. She had once worn military fatigues with pride, and now she found herself in a frigid cell clad in attire designed for the defeated, though she had not yet surrendered. She had played by every rule, enlisting immediately after high school, serving 2 arduous tours overseas, enduring injuries, nightmares, and endless sleepless nights. When she returned home, she believed her country would care for her just as she had once safeguarded it, only to be sorely mistaken. At the VA clinic, a 6-month waiting list loomed, while her disability checks scarcely afforded food. Job applications met silence, and when queried about her employment gap, employers offered sympathetic nods without follow-up, and then came the eviction, as her landlord cared not for her service, only that the rent was overdue. Desperate, she attempted the shelters, but they were perpetually full, so she claimed an abandoned house on Livingston Avenue. It lacked heat and running water, yet offered 4 walls and a roof. Though she was no criminal, Tonight, she would slumber behind bars like one. Her stomach rumbled, yet she dismissed its protest, accustomed to hunger, while the cell reeked of sweat and disinfectant, a space designed to strip away one's humanity. The following morning, a weary public defender visited Vanessa Price. Flipping through a slim folder, he stated, "You're charged with trespassing. It's a misdemeanor, but if you have prior offenses, I don't," she replied. He nodded, adding, "The DA might offer a deal, time served or community service. Do you have anywhere to go if released?" She remained silent, for truthfully, she had nowhere. He sighed, scribbling notes, "You'll appear before the judge tomorrow, just be respectful, and we'll see what unfolds." Yet, she harbored little hope. She had witnessed firsthand how the system operated. People like her, the homeless and disempowered, rarely emerged from courtrooms with their dignity intact. That night, she lay on a rigid cot, gazing at the ceiling, pondering, would they release her, and if so, where would she go? She had no answer. Yet by the following afternoon, whispers of her name would echo through every corner. The next morning, Vanessa stood shivering in the holding cell, waiting to be summoned. Her hands trembled not from fear but sheer exhaustion. She hadn't slept at all. At last, a guard opened the door, declaring, "Let's go, Price." The courtroom proved smaller than she had anticipated, a space where cases were processed swiftly, merely another file on the judge's endless docket. Vanessa shuffled forward, her wrists shackled and a chain around her waist clinking softly. A few onlookers sat in the gallery, strangers with idle gazes, some watching intently, others feigning indifference. In the back, a journalist clutched a notebook, poised to document yet another case rendered nameless by the system. Then entered Judge Thomas Whitaker, his white hair and glasses perpetually slipping down his nose, as if burdened by 1,000 similar cases. He scarcely lifted his gaze while perusing the paperwork. The clerk intoned, "Vanessa Price, charged with criminal trespassing. How do you plead?" Her lawyer leaned in, whispering, "Not guilty, Your Honors," and she responded in a calm, measured tone. Standing nearby, the prosecutor, a woman in a sharp gray suit, flipped through her notes, as though Vanessa's fate had been predetermined. "Your Honor, the defendant was found trespassing on condemned property and was removed by officers following multiple resident complaints. We request standard sentencing, time served and mandatory probation." Those words stung. She was treated merely as another defendant, not a person, not a veteran. Finally, the judge raised his gaze and asked, "Miss Price, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Vanessa hesitated. What words could alter her fate? "I'm not a criminal, Your Honors," she finally uttered. "I merely needed a place to rest." A murmur swept through the courtroom as the judge sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose, and stated, "Miss Price, the law is unequivocal. That property was not yours. I understand you admitted it, but you claim you had no alternative." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, interjecting, "Everyone has a choice, Miss Price." Vanessa offered a dry, humorless chuckle, and a brief silence followed. For the first time, the judge regarded her not as a case file but as a human being. He scanned the file before him, his expression softening as he read something unexpected. Then he turned to the prosecutor and commanded, "Read this report." The prosecutor nodded, "Yes, Your Honor," then began to read aloud, though she hesitated. "Read it." Judge Whitaker ordered. "Prosecutor, clear your throat," as she suddenly appeared uncomfortable. Vanessa Price, a former U.S. Army sergeant who served 2 tours in Afghanistan, received an honorable discharge and multiple commendations, including the Bronze Star. Another murmur rippled through the courtroom as the journalist scribbled furiously, and a few onlookers in the gallery straightened in their seats. The judge returned his gaze to Vanessa and inquired, "Miss Price, is this true?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied. Leaning back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk, the judge asked, "And what transpired after your service?" She swallowed hard. "I came home, sought employment, but no one would hire me. The VA clinic had a 6-month wait, my disability checks were insufficient, I lost my apartment, and I merely struggled to survive." A heavy silence engulfed the room. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, as if suddenly aware that this was no ordinary case. The judge exhaled slowly, then resumed flipping through the file. "Well," he muttered, "that changes things," but no one anticipated what he would declare next. Judge Whittaker drummed his fingers on the bench, his expression inscrutable. The courtroom was so hushed that Vanessa could hear her own heartbeat. Then he spoke, "Miss Price, do you know who I am?" Vanessa frowned in confusion. "No, Your Honor." The judge nodded slowly. "I didn't expect you to, but I remember you." The prosecutor looked up sharply. The journalist in the back halted his writing. The judge adjusted his glasses and addressed the courtroom. 15 years ago, my son served in Afghanistan. He was but a fresh-faced recruit, scarcely out of high school. He recounted tales of Sergeant Price, a woman who trained new soldiers, drove them to excel, and even saved his life when his convoy was struck by an IED. A stunned silence fell over the room. Vanessa's mouth parted slightly in disbelief. She had trained dozens, perhaps hundreds, of young soldiers whose faces had blurred together over time. "She was the toughest person I had ever met," he confided. The judge continued, "She didn't merely instruct them in combat, she taught them to survive and to care for one another." "I hadn't realized until now that he was referring to you." The gravity of his words descended upon Vanessa like a heavy blanket, one she wasn't certain she desired. The prosecutor cleared her throat, clearly disconcerted. "Your Honor, Judge Whittaker raised a hand, silencing her, and inquired, "Miss Price, do you know where my son is now?" Vanessa shook her head. "He didn't make it home." The atmosphere grew even heavier as the judge sighed, massaging his temple, and recalled, "Before he passed, he told me the hardest part of serving isn't the war, it's coming home. Soldiers often don't receive a hero's welcome, instead, they return only to find no place awaits them." Vanessa offered no reply, for none was needed. The judge then turned to the prosecutor. "Let me ask you, if my son had survived and found himself in Miss Price's shoes, would we be having this very conversation right now?" The prosecutor hesitated. "Your Honor, the law." Before she could continue, he interjected, "Forget the law for a moment. Would we be here? Would we treat him like this?" His question hung in the air, suffocating, and the prosecutor remained silent. The judge exhaled slowly and returned his gaze to Vanessa, saying in a quieter tone, "You should never have ended up in this courtroom, this country has failed you." Yet what followed stunned everyone. Judge Whittaker's eyes swept across the courtroom as every soul watched and waited. He leaned forward, his voice both steady and firm. "I've served on this bench for over 20 years, he declared. "I've witnessed repeat offenders and individuals with every chance to choose the right path yet who did not. But that is not what I see here today." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably as the judge continued, "I see a woman who devoted her life to serving this country, a woman abandoned by the very system that vowed to care for her, and now we dare to punish her for merely trying to survive." He scoffed and shook his head. "That is not justice." Vanessa held her breath as the judge examined the paperwork before him, then, without hesitation, he tore it in half. Gasps erupted in the courtroom, even the bailiff appeared astonished. "Miss Price," he declared, tossing the shredded pages aside, "I am dismissing this case effective immediately, you are free to go." The words barely registered as Vanessa blinked in disbelief, uncertain if she had heard correctly. The prosecutor began to protest, but the judge offered no chance for rebuttal. Furthermore, he continued, "I am making some calls. I know contacts in the Ohio Veterans Affairs Office and the Franklin County Housing Program, so that by the end of today, you will have a safe place to reside and a caseworker to assist you in rebuilding your life." Vanessa's hands clenched the rough wooden defense table, and her legs wavered as though they might collapse beneath her. "Is that real?" she murmured softly. Judge Whittaker's expression softened. "It's the least we can do." The burden Vanessa had borne for years suddenly felt lighter, tears welled at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had long mastered toughness and a guarded heart, yet now, for the first time in ages, someone was fighting on her behalf. The judge nodded at the bailiff to remove her restraints. The cold metal slid from her wrists as she absent-mindedly rubbed them. Still in disbelief, she listened as the judge turned to the prosecutor. "I expect your office to re-evaluate these cases. You cannot simply check a box and move on, when people's lives hang in the balance." The prosecutor, visibly flustered, gave a stiff nod. Vanessa inhaled deeply. She had entered the courtroom believing her future was bleak, but now, for the first time in years, a glimmer of hope emerged. Yet the instant she stepped beyond the courthouse doors, the true test began. The cold air struck her as she exited the Franklin County Courthouse. Standing on the steps, blinking in the harsh afternoon sun, she felt as though awakened from a long, surreal dream, free, yet with freedom proving to be an intricate challenge. A cluster of reporters had assembled, sensing a newsworthy tale. One woman, a journalist with a press badge around her neck, rushed forward and demanded, "Miss Price, how does it feel to have your case dismissed?" Vanessa regarded her briefly, then brushed past, as onlookers, who had overlooked her mere hours before, now gawked as if she were someone truly remarkable. With a slow exhale, Vanessa confessed, "I don't know yet." A car pulled up to the curb, and a woman in business casual attire stepped out, one of the contacts Judge Whitaker had summoned. "Miss Price," she said, "I'm from the Franklin County Veterans Housing Program. We have a place for you." The words sounded almost surreal. A place for her? For years, she had been nothing more than a shadow in the city, a face people deliberately ignored. Now, someone was truly seeing her. Vanessa hesitated. She had spent so many years merely surviving that accepting help felt alien. Yet, recalling the judge's words, and realizing that today, someone had chosen to do what was right, she reconsidered. She nodded and stepped toward the car. As the door closed behind her, she glanced out the window to see another homeless veteran on a bench, head bowed and arms wrapped around himself. She was not alone. While she might be receiving a second chance, how many others still awaited theirs? The car pulled away. Yet Vanessa knew this was not the end of her struggles. After years of serving her country, perhaps now it was time to battle for those left behind. How can we allow this to continue? Men and women serve our nation, sacrificing their bodies, minds, and futures, only to return home and be left to fend for themselves, forgotten and punished for their struggles. Vanessa's story is not unique. Thousands of veterans live on the streets, battling the very system meant to protect them. The question remains, what are we doing about it? If her story stirs something deep within, let it kindle resolve to support veteran housing initiatives and organizations aiding homeless veterans. Even a simple act, a meal, a conversation, or a job opportunity, can alter lives. Vanessa got lucky, yet no one should be forced to rely on luck to survive. Let us ensure that stories like hers meet more hopeful conclusions.